We will be continuing our study in the book of Judges, so if you want to go ahead and flip your Bibles to the book of Judges, chapter 3, we will pick up there in a few moments. But before we do that, since it has been a couple of minutes since the last time we were together, I want to review just a recap of what we went over last time. So Judges picks up from the leadership of Joshua crossing over the Jordan, conquering the land, and now the people are without a leader. Joshua passes away, and before he does that, he gives the people a choice. He says, serve God or serve the idols in which the land you're conquering, but you have to pick one or the other. And the people say, far be it from us, we're going to serve God. And Joshua warns them. He says, God is a jealous God. God is a hard God to serve. If you choose this, you better be committed to it. You better commit yourself to God and do so fully. And we'll see the fallout from those decisions that are made through the book of Judges of the people not committing themselves fully to God. They will make decisions that will be in opposition to God, and God's punishment will be swift and just. Now, just to recap a few highlights here. First, we call this book a book of judges, but in reality, it's not the kind of judge we're used to. It's not someone in a black coat discerning or describing the law. These are more along the lines of chiefs, of regional leaders that will be appointed to dole out justice as God sees fit. The Hebrew word that's used here is savat, and in English it's a better translation of chieftain or leader, warrior, and that mentality. The book's going to cover about 380 to 400 years, give or take, of time between Joshua and when Samuel will anoint Saul as the king of Israel. The book is really summed up by the last verse of the book. And it says, in that day there was no king in Israel, and every man did what he thought was right in his own eyes. So everyone was just kind of going and doing whatever they wanted to do, and we'll see the progression of the people from being kind of okay to absolutely the worst possible example of humanity that's out there. So one of the cycles that we see repeat throughout the book is that there's a time of peace, whether it's regional or national. The next generation comes along and they forget God. They forget who God is, and then they start serving little carved images, the Baals and Asheroth. And then God, as promised, brings judgment. Whether it's external or internal, there'll be some pressure for the people of God to get their act straight. And eventually, the light bulb comes on and people say, hey, wait a second, we had it better under God. We should go to God. And they do. God raises up a judge, and the judge delivers the people from some form of oppression. And then they have peace for a little while, and then the cycle starts all over again. Now, many of the judges that are brought up in the book, they're not the greatest people in the world. They're people who, unfortunately, are the best that Israel has to offer. And God uses them, but definitely does not approve of many of their actions individually or in their actions in the form of leadership. As we get later on into the book of Judges, we'll see that more clearly. One real quick note that is both a personal note for me and also a hope and warning for each of you is that of an attitude that we can take while studying this book in particular, or many of the actions of the Old Testament. It's easy to sit back and look and say, hey, wait a second. These people just crossed the Red Sea, just crossed, the Jordan on dry land and saw God keep the sun up in the sky longer than it was supposed to and do all these wonderful things, and yet they fall prey to this? They fall prey to little graven images? But the reality is that there's nothing new under the sun. Mankind's still dealing with the same sins. Our idols are not as clearly identified as these idols that are in the Old Testament, but we still have our idols. We still forget God, going out and allowing other things to distract us. So it could be really easy to look back and be hard and be skeptical and be frustrated with these people. But in reality, I find myself falling prey to a lot of the same things. I can forget God. And so it's important that we not take that attitude, that we take the lessons that are here written for us and remember that God is always there. God's always watching. And we can't allow the distractions of this life to knock us off course. So let's go ahead and get into the book here for just a moment. Judges, the 3rd chapter. Let's read the chapter and then we'll get started in discussion of it. Judges 3, and I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all that Israel had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. Just a pause here for just a second. All of these nations that were left in the land were left for a reason. Not by God, though, but God was going to use them. If you flip back to chapter 1 and verse 28, we see the real reason that these nations are here. Judges 1:28 says that when Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor and did not drive them out completely. This was a greed thing. The people of Israel realized, hey, wait a second, there's a bunch of people here that we could put to work to do whatever we want to do, so let's just leave them. When God's instructions were very clear, both in Deuteronomy and in Joshua, go in, destroy everything, destroy everyone. And we'll see this again repeated, when Saul comes back from defeating the Amalekites. And Samuel comes up and says, what do I hear? Why do you have this stuff? This was all supposed to be destroyed. And the same sentiment here. God said, go in, destroy it all. And just a side note here for, some application for us. If we are trying to live a pure and whole life before God, we can't allow a little bit of sin to still remain. That nanometer of sin is all it takes for us to lose our souls. We have to destroy it fully. Anyway, let's get back to Judges chapter 3, beginning again in verse 2. And it was in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach wars to those who had not known it before. These are the nations: the 5 lords of the Philistines, all of the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites that lived in the mountain of Lebanon, and Mount Baal-Hamon, and those who lived in Lebo-Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters took them for wives, and they also took their daughters and gave to their sons, and they served their gods. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and Asheroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he sold them into the hand of Cush-Ramathashan, the king of Mesopotamia. The people of Israel served Cush 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, son of Kezan, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave him Cush, the king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and in his hand he prevailed over them. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kezan, died. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel. And they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered himself the Amorites and the Amalekites, and he defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. This will be Jericho. And the people of Israel served Eglon 18 years. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, a left-handed man, and the people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh. And he presented tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when Eglon had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols of Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded him, Silence. And all of his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him, and when he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber, and Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he rose from his seat, and Ehud reached his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went with the blade, and the fat closed around the blade, for he did not pull out the sword from his belly, and dung came out. And Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. And when he was gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof of the chamber were locked, they thought, Surely he is relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. And they waited until they were embarrassed. And when he did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. And there lay their lord dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Shirai. And when he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hills of Ephraim, and the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country. He was their leader. And he said to them, Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies into your hands, the Moabites. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel. And the land had rest for 80 years. And after him Shamgar, the son of Anath, killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and so he saved Israel. So here we're introduced to the first three judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. And Shamgar gets a whole wonderful one verse, which is kind of interesting, but we'll get down to him here in just a second. Now again, the people had invited this problem in, and God says, okay, you wanted to keep these Canaanites, these people, to do your forced labor for you, and now I'm going to use them. Now I'm going to use them to test you, to see whether or not you're going to obey. And they made the decision to not. They started intermarrying, they started connecting, they started letting their guard down and didn't remember God, and so God handed them over. When God handed them over to the land of Mesopotamia, the king Cush, and I know I'm probably butchering the rest of his last name, the land of Mesopotamia really is what we would probably think of later as Assyria or Syria now. It's going to be the northern area up near where the Tigris and Euphrates are kind of split. It's a very fertile area, very, very wonderful compared to the desert just to the south and west and north of it. But at this time, they oppressed Israel. And what I find kind of interesting is Israel's kind of okay with it. For 8 years, they just sit back and they're like, okay, yeah, we'll take it. We'll be under bondage. And again, my attitude of looking back and kind of being skeptical, I wonder why 8 years? Why did it take 8 years for the light bulb to go off? And then I can look at my own life and be like, wait, why did it take 6 seconds for me to realize what I just did was wrong? Or why did I even think that was kind of okay? And it's an important lesson to learn that we can't just forget God. It's very easy to. And it's very easy in some cases to go a long period of time and forget God. But finally, after 8 years, we see that Othniel is selected by God to go and to defeat this enemy. Now, Othniel's been mentioned once before. He, back in the first chapter, is a conqueror of southern Israel when Judah asked Simon to come and help conquer their territory on the west side of the Jordan. So he's already been a military leader. He's already devoted himself towards conquering, towards fighting, and he's probably an older gentleman at this time. This has been some time since the land has been completely conquered, and so he's got his estate, he's got his territory, he's, all set. There's no reason for him to necessarily have to get involved. but God calls on him again to be a leader. And out of all of the judges, he's probably one of the better ones spiritually. He's still in line with God. He's still a leader. Unfortunately, the people need saving yet again. So we'll see this repeated again many times, actually 14 times out of the 15 judges, that the Spirit of the Lord is going to come upon them and he's going to save them. Now, I find it interesting that we don't get a body count here. We don't get, he took this city or did this, but all we get is the understanding that he defeated the Mesopotamians and freed Israel. And for 40 years, they had peace. Now, this wasn't really the whole land, if we do the math. This is probably just the northern regions. And we'll see this repeated on later on, because if you look at the timetable, several of these judges are going to overlap. And so really, when they talk about the land having peace, it's just their region, not the country as a whole. Again, the writer of Judges is going to say, in that time there was no king. There was no central leadership. The people were not, looking towards God. They were just deciding whatever they thought was a good idea. We're gonna run with that. So, after or during this period of time in 40 years, we get the Moabites, the Amalekites, and I'm going to butcher more names here, the Amalekites. As you can tell, I'm really, really good at pronouncing some of these terrible names, so don't ask me to read the genealogies in Matthew. That's just not going to happen. But Moab, which was a sworn enemy of Israel, they've been, at conflict with them for a long time. They're actually distant cousins of each other. But Moab finally overthrows the southern parts of Israel. In particular, we see that they were holding the forwards of Jordan. This would have been the area that really would have been a major trade hub and a major bridge crossing the east and the west together from each other. And they take all of that. And after how many years does it take? 18 before they finally decide, oh wait, we probably should ask God for help. God raises up Ehud. Now, I find it kind of interesting that the Bible decides to mention that Ehud is a left-handed man. It's an odd fact, right? If you think about it. But going back and doing a little bit more reading with some of the other translations in Septuagint in particular, this idea is that he's capable of using both hands. He's ambidextric. His normal right hand is his right hand, but he's able to use his left as well. But why God decides to include that in here is still a baffling mystery to me. But anyway, they've been sending tribute to Moab for some time. And so Ehud goes. And whether this message supposedly from God is really from God, or Ehud just makes it up as a chance to get the opportunity to get this king alone, is an unknown at this point, but it doesn't matter. God blesses Ehud and uses him to kill the king. Now, I don't want to get too gruesome here, but if you think about a sword that's a cubit in length, that's about 18 inches, going into somebody with the hilt and it all being swallowed up, he was not a small guy at all. That's just, he definitely was living rich and high on the life and really on the back of the people of Israel. He was very much so enjoying his position of power and oppressing the people. And that just makes me feel sad for the people of Israel, that all the blessings that they could have been enjoying, they've been handing over because of their sin. And how often do we do the same? How often do we hand over the wonderful things that God has given us for an eternity of things we hand over for temporal things? We are a microwave society. We want things now, and yet we hand over things that are eternal for things that are going to be eaten by moths and stolen by somebody else. Things that we can't take off into the next life. Anyway, Ehud goes ahead and strikes down the king. When he gets back to Israel, he sounds the trumpet. He gathers the people together, and they finally listen. They gather behind him, and he says, God has given this victory into your hands. God has given us. Let's go take this victory. And they will. They will get together, and they will listen, and they will follow God, and they're delivered. They're given peace. And by the way, it's not a little bit of peace. Ehud has 80 years that region will enjoy peace after him. 80 years. That's a long time, especially if you compare it to the Othniel just a few minutes ago, where they only get 40 years of peace. Ehud's area gets 80 years of peace. They follow God, and they slay 10,000 Moabites. And it's recorded that the Moabites really never recover. And we see later on in the history, especially in the Kings, that they never get back to this power and overthrowing Israel like they did in this day. God delivers them. God takes care of them. But only when they listen. Only when they go to the battle cry, they take up their swords and do what they're asked to do. And finally, we get down to the one-verse judge. We know very little about Shamgar. We know that he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And that's it. A whole lot of lessons to learn there. Really, right? What I think we can learn, though, from these three judges are a couple of things. One, each of us has a different capacity, a different ability, and a different capability to offer to God, and God's going to use it. I may not be a good song leader. I may not be a good this or a good that, but God's going to use what talents I have. Whether it's to kill 600 Philistines, 10,000 Moabites, or an unknown number of Mesopotamians, God can use whatever I've got. God can use my talents and capabilities to serve his needs, to serve his eternal plan, as long as I'm willing to follow. As long as I'm willing to obey and learn and listen and do. In conclusion, I'd like to take us to the book of Isaiah 42. And I'd like to tell you about a different judge. Isaiah 42, beginning in verse 1, and we're going to read through verse 9 here in a second. See, these men that were judges were fallible men. Yes, they were empowered, and the Spirit of God came upon them, and they would deliver the people of Israel for a time, their region, for 40 years or 80 years or an unknown specified amount of time. But there's a judge that Isaiah is going to talk about, that we're going to read about here in just a second, that's going to bring justice for an eternity. So let's read Isaiah chapter 42, beginning in verse 1. Behold my servant, when I uphold my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nation. Notice again that parallel of God's Spirit coming upon this judge. He will not cry aloud or lift his voice or make it heard in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes on it, and he gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you a covenant for a people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes of those who are blind, to bring out the prisoners from dungeons and from prisons who sit in darkness. I am the Lord. That is my name. My glory I will give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I will now declare. Before they spring forth, I will tell you of them. This judge that Isaiah is talking about is a judge who is going to not break the broken reed. He's not going to be overly burdensome. He's not going to put out the fire, even if it's just a smoldering little wick. He's going to give light to those who are in darkness and bring out those who are in prison. And he is going to be not only empowered by the Spirit of God, but sorry, I lost my place here. verse 8, he says, I am the Lord, that is my name, I will give my glory to no other. Meaning, this person who's coming is going to be God. He's not going to give his glory to another judge. He's not going to give his praise to another person or carved idols, but instead he's going to be giving this position of a justice bringer to the nations. Some of your Bibles may say Gentiles, but to every one of us. And in Matthew, in the 12th chapter, verse 6, Matthew will say, this was written, and then he'll quote this passage, so that you know who this Jesus is. This judge that comes for an eternity is come now for us to have the opportunity to have justice. And not the kind of justice that is condemning, but the kind of justice that is eternally hopeful. The kind of justice that throws off oppression. The kind of justice that stands up for the innocent, defends those who are defenseless, takes in the lame and the weak and the wayward, and gives them hope, gives them instructions, gives them life eternal. That's the judge. We're going to continue on our study in October on Deborah and Barak for a couple of lessons back to back. And we'll continue to look through those judges. And as they get worse and worse and worse and worse, if we compare them to Christ, Christ looks all that much better. This morning, we have an opportunity, as we do every single day, to get out of the bonds of slavery and sin, to look to God. It doesn't take 8 years or 18 years or 5 seconds for us to turn around and say, hey, wait a second, no. I had it better under God. I'm going back to the real judge. I'm going back to the arbiter. I'm going back to the perfecter of our faith. We have a new covenant, according to Isaiah, one which will give us the ability not to be slaves, but sons. Now's the time. If you've never made that commitment before, if you've never given yourself to Christ, we can help you with that. We can help you understand what is necessary for salvation. And if you have, and for some reason you've allowed an idol to get inside your head, you've allowed something to distract you from your relationship with God, now's the time. It doesn't need to wait. Don't wait for an opportune moment, because it's never going to happen. And the deeper and deeper, the longer you wait, it's going to get worse. Now's the time. Please come forward as we stand and sing.